This special presentation was produced in high definition by WEDU, Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota.
Coming up next, the not guilty verdict in the George Zimmerman trial sparks a national debate and demonstrations. There are calls for Florida to repeal the Stand Your Ground law. Consumer champion Mike Fasano might be leaving the state legislature, and questions are raised about how House Speaker Will Weatherford earns money when he's not working in the legislature. Political Insights next on Florida This Week.
From the WEDU studios, this is Florida This Week. And now, moderator Rob Lorine.
Welcome back. This week our panelists are Adam Smith is the political editor at the Tampa Bay Times. Eric Deggans is the media TV critic at the Tampa Bay Times and author of Race Baiter. Bill Bunting is a state committeeman from Pasco County and a Republican. And Reverend Charles McKenzie is the state coordinator for the Rainbow Push Coalition and a Democrat. Well, thank you for coming. It's good to have you here. In their first public statement since the trial, Trayvon Martin's parents say that they're still in shock and disbelief that jurors last Saturday acquitted George Zimmerman in the 2012 shooting death of their 17-year-old son. Martin's parents made appearances on the network news shows this week. Sabrina Fulton questioned whether jurors looked at the shooting from her son's point of view.
It came as a complete shock for me, but I just thought the human side of them, the human side of them would say, listen, this was a kid. This guy made a mistake. This wasn't a burglar. And just for them to suggest that that he was a burglar or that by any means he was committing any crime, is just not true. It's absolutely not true.
And Martin's father, Tracy Martin, says that they believe the killer of their unarmed child was going to be convicted.
We thought that there was enough evidence there, no matter who was on that jury, to convict him of second-degree murder. And when you think about it, I think that they just took into account what George Zimmerman said was the truth. Trayvon wasn't here to tell his story, but the mindset of that juror, some of them had their minds made up, no matter what story was told.
Zimmerman faced second-degree murder charges. Prosecutors accused Zimmerman, who identifies himself as Hispanic, of profiling Martin, who was black. Zimmerman claimed he shot Martin in self-defense after Martin attacked him. Around the nation, thousands of people took part in demonstrations in response to the verdict. Most were peaceful, but there were some arrests and incidents of vandalism. So, Eric, what did you make of the reaction of the country after the verdict was announced?
Well, what struck me about the Zimmerman case is it's a reaction to the frustration and the anger over the fact that the central question here, how did the fight start between these two people, couldn't be answered by anyone. And when Zimmerman was arrested and they brought charges and we knew there was going to be a trial, the one thing I was hoping was that the prosecution could answer that question beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think the one thing that we can say for sure that this verdict indicated is that they didn't do that. They couldn't say how this fight started between these two individuals. And I feel like a lot of the passionate reaction to this is a response to that. And you have some people who defended George Zimmerman and feel like this is a vindication of their point of view. It's not necessarily. And then you have some people who've totally lost faith in the criminal justice system. But point of fact is the prosecution didn't have that key piece of evidence. And the thing that's disappointed me as a person who writes about race a lot and a person of color is that I have gotten, my piece, I wrote a piece in Monday's paper about how I would hope the jurors would talk about how they reached their decision so we could judge what this decision means. And that column was like a Rorschach test, I think, because I tried to be very even-handed about it. And I got these emails from people telling me I should go back to where my ancestors came from. I got these emails where people who you could tell were already sort of prejudiced but were hiding it now felt like they could come forth and say all these ugly things. We had Pat Buchanan saying in a column, advising black people that white racism isn't their problem. This is a guy who got fired from MSNBC for authoring a book that said that the growing diversity of America was like its suicide. I mean, when a guy like that feels confident enough to tell black America how they should feel about racism, you feel a mask is being ripped off in some way. And I don't know that it had much to do with the verdict other than how it's resonating in society, how people are responding to it.
Bill, let me ask you, what did you make of the response that you read about, saw, talked to your friends about to the verdict in the Zimmerman trial?
I watched the trial quite a bit, and I thought it was a fair trial. I thought that the prosecution never made their case. They were at ground zero, and I think they helped the defense more than they hurt themselves. So when the jury deliberated, they didn't take it lightly. They spent over 12 hours. They sent back to the judge what they wanted to read and reread about the case, and they came out and they made a decision. And the decision was that he was not guilty. I think what bothers me is when we have similarities, that when we have O.J. Simpson commits a crime, I don't see any riots in the street. But on the other hand, we look at Los Angeles and we look at Oakland. What's the point of tearing up the cars, breaking the windows, and doing the damage? I mean, what good does that do for the black race? I don't think it helps at all.
Charles, what was your reaction?
My reaction to the verdict was this, and I understand the frustration. I agree with Eric that the central question of how the altercation started on site was not answered. But we know the one who initiated the chase, who was not authorized to chase this young man at night in an area where he had the right to be, unarmed, and we know how it ended, and we know that one of the law enforcement people who was on site charged him on site with unjustifiable homicide. That it was, he felt that it was a manslaughter that took place, that he used unreasonable force. I listened to the jurors, and I had to conclude that it was a matter of how they formed their opinions. I don't necessarily think that they reached a scientific conclusion. I think they reached a conclusion based on what they felt and how they interpreted the information that was given to them. Now, in response to Bill's statement regarding O.J. Simpson, I think it's outrageous to compare these two cases unless you want to talk about there being some kind of a inevitable racial component to the way cases are decided. Secondly, the vast majority of the responses were peaceful. There were few vandal incidents, and I think it's an exaggerated and disproportionate view to take that this has anything to do with O.J. Simpson and his trial, and that it has anything to do with the black race and their negative response to this case.
Bill, I would echo that. That was one thing I was going to say when I heard what he said. As far as we know, there was one protest where police had to get involved, and there were protests all over the country after this verdict that were almost always peaceful. And to have so many people assume that there was going to be riots. Again, Rush Limbaugh predicted that the media was inciting riots in its coverage of Zimmerman. That's insulting to people of color to feel that we can't feel passionately about a court verdict without people being afraid that riots are going to break out. And we've had several days since the verdict. We haven't had hardly any violence, and we're still debating this question and having to push back against it, and that's discomforting.
And Bill, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the things that were said here.
Okay, well, in Los Angeles and in Oakland, they burned the American flag, they damaged the cars, they broke the store windows.
In Oakland, one protest.
And in L.A.
Let me ask you a question.
How many cities were there protests?
Let me just back up for a little bit.
There was a protest in Tallahassee where they took over the governor's office. That was completely peaceful.
That's fine.
But let me just back up for a minute and ask you this question. In those sound bites from Trayvon's parents, they were suggesting that the jury wasn't able to put themselves in Trayvon's position and to understand what Trayvon felt that night. Does anybody here think the decision would have been different by the jury if the jury had 1, 2, or 3 or more African Americans on it? Because this was a largely white jury, one Hispanic was on the jury. Bill, do you think the outcome of the...
That's a good point, but why not ask the defense, the prosecutor, I'm sorry, at this point, why didn't he had a choice of picking them. Why didn't he pick them? I didn't see it come through. He had every opportunity to do it.
Charles, do you think the jury makeup had anything to do with the outcome?
I think it had a lot to do with it, and I think, as Professor said, that there's a kind of implicit thing that happens in the minds of people. And let's not kid ourselves. We are not in a post-racial society. Racial identity goes into a lot of the decisions that we make. And there are studies by the Sentencing Project and other agencies that have done research to show that white jurors have an inability to be empathetic in a case where there is a white versus a black defendant, or in cases where a white is being prosecuted for having done something against a person of color, that they cannot reach the empathy level. Somehow, people believe that in the case of Trayvon Martin, that these jurors could not see him as the victim. And when that prosecutor showed that picture of him without the shirt on and with a gold in his mouth, they think that was like the Willie Horton story. It was an effort to prey on the fears of those white jurors.
Adam, let me ask you this: the political impact of this. I mean, because politicians are weighing in on this. We're hearing a lot of debate about race in this country. What do you think the political impact is of the outcome of the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman trial?
I don't know that there is much political impact to it. I think people, there are people that come with their preconceptions and their own prejudices, etc. And then there are also a lot of people that, I think even some people on the jury released a statement after the one jury spoke who sort of implied they wanted to do something to punish the shooter, but the law was the law, and the instructions were the instructions, and they had little choice. I think, there's going to be some political repercussions with stand your ground and maybe some gun control issues, but in terms of this verdict, I think it's just simply a tragedy.
One thing I would point out quickly is I'm not one to jump and say that white jurors can't be sympathetic to black victims, or that the race of the jury would have made a huge difference, because we don't know that for sure. But we can look at what the one juror who has spoken up said. And she said that she believed George Zimmerman's story fully. And you have to sort of ask yourself, why did she buy into his story so fully? I mean, here's a guy who has every reason to be dishonest about what happened between the two of them to save his own skin. But she fully believed his version of events, and she also said she felt like Trayvon Martin helped to cause his own death. So for whatever reason, her sympathy seemed to lie more with George Zimmerman than Trayvon Martin, based on the one interview that she's done.
Charles, we're going to move on to our next topic, but it's related. Florida's Stand Your Ground law is under heavy scrutiny in the wake of the Zimmerman verdict.
While Zimmerman's attorney did not ask for a stand your ground hearing before the actual trial, in the end, the judge's instructions to the jury clearly laid it out. The jury instructions advised that Zimmerman could be acquitted if the jury decided that he was engaged in lawful activity. The instructions said he had no duty to retreat and had the right to stand his ground and could meet force with force. There are now calls for the state to reconsider the Stand Your Ground law, which was first passed by the legislature in 2005 with heavy backing from the National Rifle Association. Among the critics of the law, the Dream Defenders, who sat in this week at the state capitol, Reverend Al Sharpton.
Why? Because there's a law in this state called Stand Your Ground that is the worst violation of civil rights of state law in this country. And until we can overturn Stand Your Ground, we risk other Trayvon Martins.
And Attorney General Eric Holder.
There has always been a legal defense for using deadly force if, and the if is important, if no safe retreat is available. But we must examine laws that take this further by eliminating the common sense and age-old requirement that people who feel threatened have a duty to retreat outside their home if they can do so safely.
Some want the governor to call a special session, but the governor said no. He said that he's already heard from a 19-person bipartisan state task force which found that there was no need to change the law.
Charles, what do you make of this debate over Stand Your Ground? Is it germane, and should the law be repealed?
Well, let me begin by saying Stand Your Ground is symptomatic of something that I think is a larger malady in this society, and it goes back as far as the war on drugs, the prison industrial complex. I often hear people boast of us having the best criminal justice system in the world. Well, I don't know that we can make that claim without having some real reflection upon it. We have 500,000 more people in prison than communist China in this country. Our country has the distinction of having one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. In fact, having one of the highest incarceration rates in history. We arrest more people for more reasons and for longer periods of time than most societies have done in history. So I think we need to be a little bit more balanced and perhaps a little bit more modest in our claim that this is such a great system. And there are also racial disparities, and that has been substantiated in this system.
Bill, let me ask you the same question. There's a debate over stand your ground, whether it should be repealed. Is it germane to this case, and should it be repealed?
It's not germane to this case, and it won't be repealed. You can count on that. It's not going to happen in
no
the state of
special
Florida.
session.
There'll be no special session.
Again, I would point out that one juror who has spoken has said that the stand your ground elements that were included in the jury instructions factored into their decision in Trayvon Martin. So I don't think it's accurate to say that stand your ground was not a part of this case. One juror has said that it affected their deliberations. I would say, just to comment on this law real quickly, the provision of the law that requires the police to not arrest someone unless they have an overwhelming amount of evidence, I think that's a problem. When you have a conflict that ends in a death and there's something in the law that discourages people from arresting someone and subjecting them to due process, I think that's a problem. And there's also a concern about criminalizing people who are not in the majority. When you have stop and frisk techniques in New York City where people who look a certain way are constantly examined for being possible perpetrators in crimes simply for the way they look, when you have a stand your ground law where someone who can just think that they are at physical risk can respond with deadly force, and then the cops are discouraged from even arresting that person, I think that's the problem with the law that people are zeroing.
And let me go back to Bill. Bill, make the case for us. Are we better off since Stand Your Ground was passed in 2005? Are we safer as a society here in Florida?
There's no question about it. The FBI came in and did a study here in the state of Florida, and FDLE can confirm it, that with the Stand Your Ground law, crime is significantly down in the state of Florida.
I don't think anybody's suggesting that's because of Stand Your Ground. Crime is falling everywhere, and including Florida. It was falling long before Stand Your Ground. But Bill is absolutely right. It's not going to be repealed. The public sentiment is overwhelming. I mean, the polls are shown 57%, 65% of the public support Stand Your Ground.
Well, I think that it's in order for those who are on the panel who feel that it won't be repealed. Maybe not in the short run, but I think there's such a divide that's been created by this, and there's so much tension around it, that something is going to be done to modify it if it doesn't get changed altogether. And I think the verdict is out when it comes to the racial disparity around it. Now, I know the Times has a report that they did recently where they say, well, it's about the same breakdown when it comes to black defendants versus white defendants in application of the Stand Your Ground law. But that's one study. There are others that are still out, and there's a lot of statistical data that has not been gathered. People are invoking Stand Your Ground on a daily basis across the country in the states where it is in place. And so that data has not been collected on a regular or consistent basis, and I think the Justice Department it's within their purview to demand.
Just to correct one thing, the Tampa Bay Times reporting does find that you're less likely to be convicted if you kill a black person in the middle of using a Stand Your Ground defense. But the reason why that happens is very complex, and it's not just about race. You have to look at the story to get it, but it does show that if you kill a black person, you're less likely to serve justice.
And that's funny.
Charles, I'm sorry to say,
okay, go ahead.
Republican State Representative Mike Fasano of Newport Richey has emerged as a leading candidate to replace Mike Olson, the longtime Pasco County tax collector who died last week. Governor Rick Scott must appoint a successor.
House Speaker Will Weatherford says he feels strong